Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the opening event of Bad September. My name is Catherine Dupoulou-Ménager, and I'm the Artistic Director of Bad Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I'm speaking to you from Darkinjung country. Now, before COVID intervened again, tonight would have been the night when we were getting desperately ready to start a 4-day festival tomorrow. It will now take part, COVID permitting yet again, in December from Thursday the 2nd to the 5th, with a wonderful lineup of talented fiction and true crime writers. But one of the benefits for crime writers of being in this position is that we are offering an extra online festival, and I'm really delighted to welcome Paula Hawkins as our first speaker to talk about her stunning new book, Slow Fire Burning. Welcome, Paula. Before we start the interview, I'd like to thank our sponsors, City of Sydney and Create New South Wales. You are the oxygen in our lungs. Without you, we would find life very difficult, particularly in the present uncertain climate, where we have to change, or is it pivot, at a moment's notice. We really appreciate your support, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, so thank you. We also have a relationship with Booktopia, our online bookseller, and you could buy a copy of Paula's book there, and we really appreciate their support. And now to tonight's interview. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Paula Hawkins. You all know The Girl on the Train, her first stunning crime success. You know it as a book, you may know it as a film, and you know her second book, Into the Water. Today, we're going to hear about Paula's recently released third crime book, A Slow Fire Burning. I enjoyed this book hugely with its many different layers, and I loved the setting on one of London's canals. Welcome again, Paula. Paula will be talking to Suzanne Leal. She's also a writer. Her latest book is The Deceptions. She's as well as writing, she's a regular presenter at literary events, a judge of literary awards, and a lawyer on the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Important to us, of course, she's a BAD board member and she's a huge supporter of the festival. So welcome, Suzanne. And finally, welcome to all the members of the BAD community who are watching tonight, and in particular, viewers from public libraries throughout New South Wales, be it Narromine or Newcastle, Windsor or Glen Innes or anywhere else in the state. We're so glad you could watch us from home. We hoped you'd be able to watch from the libraries, but this is better than nothing. And finally, a thank you to all the people who, when they got their tickets, donated smaller or larger amounts to us. That is so generous, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. So what's going to happen now is Paula and Suzanne will talk for about 45-50 minutes. Hold on to your questions, and Suzanne will then ask you to send them through using the Q&A facility, and she will ask them on your behalf. I'll come back very briefly to thank our speakers. Over to you now, Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Catherine. How delightful it is to be here. Good evening to those of you at home, and good morning to you, Paula. I'm so delighted to be in conversation with you, and many congratulations on this new book, A Slow Fire Burning, which is a corker of a read. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Paula, you've come to enormous attention with your book, The Girl on the Train, but I want to go backwards. I want to start before The Girl on the Train. And whilst that was the book that really attracted public attention, you'd already written other books. And early on, you wrote a book called The Money Goddess, which is a terrific title. Tell me what it is.
Money Goddess was a financial guide that I wrote, because I was a financial journalist before I started writing books, and so it was a financial guide for women, which I wrote in about 2004, and I must urge you most strongly not to buy that book and follow its advice, because it really isn't very good. It was written in a very different time, pre-financial crash.
So the financial advice is out of date, but it seems to me you hit on a way to make talking about finance to women engaging. Did that take a lot of
that was the idea. That was the idea. That it was there was lots of statistics around, which probably still it probably still holds, that women tended to be less engaged in the managing of their money. They invested less, they saved less when they had money, they tended to spend it on their children. I mean, in a good way, obviously, but so it was generally trying to sort of address that balance. And so, yeah, they were, but I still maintain that the advice probably wasn't the best in the world. But it had a good sort of intention. And
a good voice.
Yes, I hope so. A long time since I've looked at that book.
After that, you moved away from finance and you moved to novels, and you wrote 4 novels under the name Amy Silver. How did that come about?
So when I wrote the finance guide, I had an agent. It's still my agent now. So and I'd spoken to her about the possibility of writing fiction. I was interested in writing fiction. I didn't have any sort of great confidence in myself as fiction. She was approached by a publisher who had an idea for a sort of romantic comedy that they wanted actually set, with the backdrop was going to be the global financial crash. It was going to be about a young woman who works in the city, who loses her job, falls on hard times, blah, blah, blah. They had this idea, but they didn't have anyone to write it. And she suggested to me that I write this book because obviously I understood finance. But anyway, so I went off and I spent sort of 8 weeks, I think, I wrote that book. And it actually did okay. And then they came back to me and asked me to do another one the following year. And I did 4 novels in that vein, which they were all they were supposed to be quite light-hearted and romantic. And it wasn't right for me at all. It wasn't the sort of right genre for me. And the stories did keep getting darker and darker, and more terrible things kept happening to all the characters. And there was a definite sort of dissonance between what was being presented and what was actually happening in the book. So the 4th one didn't sell, and it became clear that I needed to try something different if I was going to continue with fiction.
I'm interested in the decision not to use your own name. Now, look, maybe it's just my ego, but I think you take so long to write a book. Why not have your book your name on the cover? Why did you decide to use a pseudonym for those books?
Oh no, well, the first one, I mean, was very much this. It very much wasn't my idea, and it didn't come from me at all. It would have felt very strange to put my name on it. I think I didn't want, not that I was ashamed of it, but I wanted distance from it, definitely. And actually, I think that was very helpful. Writing fiction is very exposing. So in a way, if you're a bit tentative about it, there's something quite nice about hiding behind a pseudonym.
Yeah, so it's anonymous, and you get to perhaps be more honest without giving too much of yourself, do you think?
Yeah, well, you get to try something out. That's kind of what it felt like for me. I was kind of flexing my fiction muscles, trying to find my voice without necessarily having everybody know it was me.
And what did it teach you about writing, if you can think back? Doing those 4 books, quick succession, what did you learn from that?
Oh, I mean, it was invaluable, I think, as an introduction to writing fiction, in terms of how to develop character, in terms of how to develop story arcs, how to structure a novel, how to pace a novel. But I think probably the most important lesson is just what it takes to get through writing 100,000 words, which is basically what most commercial novels are. The kind of the discipline that takes. So I think that's the thing that you just don't realize until you've done it, is quite how much discipline and quite how hard it will be, and that there is always a point about halfway through where you just feel that it's disastrous and that nothing works. You've got to push through that point, because there will always come that point, and get out the other side.
Is it the difference between being a sprint runner and a marathon runner? You come from a journalist background, so you know that you've got to get deadlines and you've got to get it done and you've got to get it quickly. To then come to be a novelist, do you use everything you've learned in journalism in terms of getting the job done, but stretch it out and learn tenacity, I suppose?
I think that's absolutely right. You do it, I guess you break it into chunks, don't you, or chapters, or a section of the book, or a certain character that you're focusing on. But it does take enormous tenacity And as I said, there are points at which you doubt yourself, and it's very difficult to get through those points, because it's not like when you're writing an article and you think, oh, this isn't going very well, I'll do something else. If you've written 30,000, 40,000 words, you're already so invested. You've dedicated months of your life to something. So it feels, yes, it does feel a real labour of love.
So by the time you came to write The Girl on the Train, you were experienced in all manner of writing. You're experienced in journalism, you're experienced in writing about finance, you're experienced in writing romance and novels, but not, as I understand it, in psychological thrillers. What drew you to that type of narrative?
I think that was always the direction in which I was headed. So it's a much more natural space for me to be writing in. Certainly, they're the sorts of books I read. I've always been drawn to some rather sort of darker stories, even if not crime fiction so much, but literary fiction that has some sort of tragedy or criminal act or what have you at its heart. Those are the sorts of things that I've always been compelled by. So it seems like incredibly obvious to me now that should have been where I was. It just took me a while to get there and to find the right kind of story to tell. I think that's the key thing, is to find the right character to write about. And in Rachel, I very much found the character that I wanted to talk about, and she felt very natural to me.
When I speak to a lot of writers, some writers say they have so many ideas, and other writers say they have one idea. Are you a writer who has too many ideas and not enough time, or do the ideas take work?
I think I have many, many ideas. I think that the difficulty is choosing the right idea, or choosing the right character to put in which story. I have lots of beginnings of novels. Notebooks and computer documents full of the beginnings of novels, like, oh, I could do that, or I could do this, or I could do that. But you've got to pick one or two and hone them, and you've got to sort of spot which one you're going to be able to carry all the way through months and months and hundreds of thousands of words. That's what you've got to do. So that for me is the difficulty, is choosing which is the right story for now and which are the right characters. And I don't always get that right, and I have had the experience of starting a novel, writing a third of it, rewriting that third of it, and again, and then having to throw it out because I just couldn't find the right way of telling the story, and I'd clearly chosen the wrong story or the wrong characters for that story at the time.
That's interesting, but with The Girl on the Train, it worked. I mean, clearly it worked extraordinarily well because it became such a sensation. When you'd finished it, did you quite honestly sit back and think, actually, I might be onto something here?
Well, I knew that the voice was right. I knew that as soon as I started writing in Rachel's voice, I knew that this was much better. This felt natural. This felt good. I could see the story quite clearly. I knew where I was going. It's quite, for me now, it seems to me now quite a streamlined story. It was quite direct. Yes, there were some jumps around in timeline and perspective, but I had a very strong concept for that novel. I had absolutely zero confidence in myself at the time. My confidence was extremely low back when I was writing The Girl on the Train, because I'd had a rough time. And as I said, the novel I'd written before was just didn't sell at all. So, however, when I showed sort of the first few chapters to my agent, she was incredibly encouraging. It was like, oh yes, you're onto something here. And I had that experience where you want to believe her, but at the same time, you're not, you can't quite, you don't quite have faith yet. I sold the manuscript when it was half finished. I put it out, my agent took it to publish for auction, and there was immediately a very strong response from publishers. So then that was when I kind of knew, oh, okay, if they're all like falling over, themselves to offer for this book, then I must be onto something.
It sounds like you've got a very close relationship to your agent, in that you can trust her to read the early parts of a manuscript and to give you constructive direction without stopping the flow. Have I read that correctly?
Oh yeah, worked together for a long time now. She's always my first reader. She and I have quite similar views about books. We like the same kind of thing. We like the same kind of writing. So she's very much someone I trust. She has fantastic insights as a book person. She's not a publisher, she's an agent, but she has great instincts. She can spot something that's going to do well. But I think more than that, it's that we were quite like-minded about lots of issues. So I very much trust her, and I find it, I never understand people who can show their early work to like their husband or their best friend, because for me that would be terrible. Like I wouldn't be able to trust anything they said, because I think they would just be nice to me. Or if they said something critical, like, you know, I would sulk for a week. So it's much better for me to have a professional early reader.
What I'd like to do is to quote from her website. This is how she describes you, and in fact, it introduces you. Paula's debut thriller, The Girl on the Train, has sold 23 million copies worldwide in over 50 countries and in 46 languages. Exactly 1 year after first publication, The Girl on the Train returned to its position as the #1 bestseller in the UK, in hardcover, the US, hardcover and ebook, and Canada. In the UK, The Girl on the Train was the best-selling work of original fiction of 2015. In the US, The Girl on the Train topped the New York Times bestseller list for 21 weeks. It has sold over 8 million copies in the US alone. Heavy stuff, I think. And my question for you is, that extraordinary out-of-the-box success of The Girl on the Train, did it make writing the next book, Into the Water, easier or harder?
I genuinely think the most difficult thing about writing the second novel was that I just didn't have the time to sit quietly in a room and focus on it. I was touring almost constantly for about 2 years after the Girl on the Train was published. The touring process just sort of went on and on. But I mean, it was a good thing, because the book was doing so well. People kept asking me to go to events, to go to festivals. I came to Australia, New Zealand, I went to Canada, I went to South America, I went all over the place, which was wonderful, but it was incredibly difficult. I can't write under those kind of circumstances, or I can, but not, I don't think I can do my best work. My best work is done when I'm sitting quietly at my desk at home, you know, concentrating on the characters that I want to concentrate on now, instead of talking about the ones I wrote 2 years ago. It's very difficult, I find, to switch from talking about Rachel and Megan and whoever from The Girl on the Train to writing Jules and Nell from Into the Water. That was a very difficult process for me.
And so did you write, or did you try to write while you were on tour, or did you just say, listen, I'm going to separate this out and I'll write once I'm back, or when I've got some quiet space?
No, I tried to write on tour. Well, I did. I mean, I basically wrote it while I was traveling for 2 years. And yeah, I got it done. I was quite ambitious with that novel. It was a huge cast of characters. It was quite a complex storyline. It was very different to The Girl on the Train. And there are still things about it that I think that I love and that I got right. And there were things that I didn't. And it was, I think everyone knows it was not well received critically. It still sold quite a few, but it was overall the publication of the second novel wasn't my happiest experience.
Look, it was my happy experience reading it, or in fact, I listened to it by audio. And what I really liked about it was your interspersing of stories with excerpts from a book. So there's a book being written by Nell, and the stories work through and work around that book. It's a device that you use in this new recently released book, Slow Fire Burning. So my question to you is, what do you like about that idea of having a book within a book?
Well, I think they serve very different functions. The one that I did in Into the Water, which was basically telling you the history of a place. So the person who's writing the book is actually not a writer, really. She's a photographer, but she's sort of, so it's kind of an art book. She's kind of putting together a history of a place. And so it was a way of telling a whole bunch of other stories while interspersed with the actual main narrative of the novel. In A Slow Fire Burning, we have a novel within a novel, which is written by one of the characters. It's a crime novel. It's both, for me, it was a way of talking about crime novels and crime writing, while at the same time there's a plot device that's attached to it. I do like books within books. I find, some people might find it a bit tricksy. I enjoy that finding different ways of telling stories within the story that you're already telling. I always enjoy that kind of playfulness.
Can I go a bit further and say that it seems like you really had a lot of fun with it?
Oh yeah, I did. This was a fun novel to write in lots of ways. There are some very, very dark subjects in it. There's a lot of tragedy and trauma, but I also managed to sort of lighten it, I think, and have fun with the book within the book, with the character who writes it, whose name is Theo, who's kind of a pompous cold git. But I loved writing him. He was a laugh.
He was great to read about as well. I want to take you to the beginning of the book, which is an absolute cracker, and I'm hoping you might even read the prologue for us.
I will do so. I'm hoping that I'm sort of. Are you hearing me okay now? Because I think I might have been a little bit quiet. Okay, you are.
I'm hearing you. And,
great.
And the technical gods haven't told us otherwise. So
brilliant. Okay. So yeah, this is the introduction. Well, it's the prologue to the novel. Blood sodden, the girl staggers into the black. Her clothes are dishevelled, hanging off her young body, revealing expanses of pale flesh. Shoe lost, foot bleeding, she's in agony, but the pain has become inconsequential, eclipsed by other sufferings. Her face is a mask of terror, her heart is a drum. Her breath is the stricken pant of a fox gone to ground. The night's silence is broken by a low hum. A plane? Wiping blood from her eyes, the girl looks up to the sky and sees nothing but stars. The hum is louder, lower, car changing gear. Has she reached the main road? Her heart lifts, and from somewhere deep in her gut, she summons the energy to run. She feels rather than sees the car behind her, the light behind her. She feels her shape illuminated in the black and knows that the car is coming from behind her. It's coming from the farm. She turns. She knows before she sees that he has found her. She knows before she sees that it will be his face behind the wheel. She freezes. For a second, she hesitates and then she leaves the road, takes off running into a ditch over a wooden fence. She scrambles into the adjacent field and runs blind, falling, picking herself up, making no sound. What good would screaming do? When he catches her, he takes handfuls of her hair, pulls her down. She can smell his breath. She knows what he is going to do to her. She knows what is coming because she has already seen him do it. She saw him do it to her friend, how savagely he... Oh, for God's sake, Irene muttered out loud, snapping the book shut and slinging it onto the charity shop pile. What utter drivel.
Fantastic. I mean, I'm going back to when I first read that book, and I'd finished Into the Water, and so I knew that there were sort of murky things that are abounding. And we start right up, we've got a map, we've got the prologue, things are going very, very badly for this young woman. And then completely we're jumped out of it, and Irene is taking us right back down to earth. Tell me, was that how you always began the book, or did the prologue come later?
No, the prologue came later because I didn't really know that I was going to do the book rather than the book right at the beginning. I hadn't come up with that conceit yet. It was later than I started writing this book within the book that is by this novelist, Theo, who thinks he's writing a deeply experimental crime novel. He's a literary writer, and he's trying his hand at crime fiction in order to get over his writer's block. But I was sort of playing with this thing that is often done at the beginning of crime novels, and I think I've done it myself too, of having some very dark, very terrifying opening that you then switch out of, and it draws you in. But often in some crime novels, they're often quite they feel a bit exploitative and a bit sort of obviously titillating you with violence being done to some poor young girl. So I was kind of making fun of that a little bit.
I like it. You've mentioned to us that Theo Meyerson is the man who's written the book. And you also said that he was a lot of fun to write, but that you never much liked him. Can you just paint a quick picture of Theo? If I were to see him in the street, what would I be looking at?
I think he's a portly gentleman. He's sort of early 50, no, so maybe late 50s. I can't remember exactly how old I made poor Theo. So yes, he's a best-selling novelist. I mean, the thing is, I'm being mean about him. He's there's plenty to recommend him. He loves his wife very, very dearly. He's unfailingly loyal to his wife. He adores her. That's kind of his main redeeming feature. But he's a comfortable man. He smokes a lot. He likes his food. He's probably a bit florid, some sort of broken veins on his cheeks there. And one would have seen him strolling around the Regent's Canal with a little dog, although sadly his dog has gone missing.
You say that he's very loyal to his wife, and his wife isn't really his wife, is she? I mean,
she's his ex-wife. Sorry, yes. So,
and that's a very interesting relationship. Tell me about her and that relationship.
So Theo and his wife Carla married a long time ago, and then they suffered a terrible tragedy, terrible family tragedy from which they had failed to recover. So they could never really get over it. They mourned very differently, they grieved very differently, and they disagreed on sort of the source of this tragedy. I'm not going to go into it because I don't want to spoil things, but they separated and then divorced. But they still love each other, and they kind of can't completely extricate themselves. So they have dinner together many times a week. Often Carla will stay the night. So yeah, they're one of those couples who can't be together, but also can't live without each other.
It really struck me as no man's land. They're neither here nor there. And I'm a bit black and white. I'm either you want me or you don't. It's either 100% or not. And your book made me think, is that a rigid way of being? Are there other ways to be? Is the relationship that Theo and Carla have, is it one that you think works when we meet them?
I mean, no, I don't think it's not good in itself. I think if it were up to Theo, he would rather they were together properly. It's Carla has kind of, I think, as you just put it very well, she lives in a kind of no man's land. She has never managed to reconcile herself to what happened, to process what happened, to move on. She's tried, but she's failed. And so she exists in a kind of no man's land where she goes through the motions of things without really committing to, well, without really living her life properly. That's kind of her tragedy.
At the beginning of the book, we find out that Carla has a nephew. His name is Daniel, and he's been murdered, his body having been found in a houseboat that he lived in, a houseboat that was moored on one of the London canals. Now, for those of us who might not be familiar with the London's canals, or given the COVID situation may have forgotten about them, can you tell me a bit about what the canals are and how it works with houseboats?
So yeah, there's just north of where I live here in London is Regent's Canal, which runs all the way across London, west to east. And it is probably the biggest canal in London. It's sort of the main one. And in various spots along there, you'll find little groups of houseboats. There are some sort of permanent moorings where people live there, as it says, permanently, and don't move their boats. There are others where you're allowed to stay for 2 weeks in one mooring and then you have to move along. And there are people who live like that, sort of a kind of nomadic existence. There are also lots of people who rent them. Like everything in the world, it's become very gentrified now. So it's maybe not the like little hippie community it once was, but it's a strange little sort of part of sort of a community outside of London, and yet at its heart. As I say, it's quite near to where I live, so I walked around there quite a lot, walked along the towpath. You have these little very pretty houseboats. Every now and again, you'll come across one that's not so pretty, that looks kind of abandoned, and the windows are filthy, and it looks like it's sinking into the water. And it did strike me when I was walking along there that there could be anything inside. There could be human remains could be in there, and you would never know about it. So that's sort of where my mind went and how I got started with this. But also on the sides of the canal, you have these lovely, gorgeous Victorian houses around here. They'll be worth millions, those kinds of houses. And next door, there'll be a tower block with social housing. This part of London, this sort of east of the city, it was quite heavily bombed in the war. So you have a huge mishmash of different kinds of housing and And as a result of different kinds of people living sort of cheek by jowl, rich and poor, powerful, powerless, all rubbing shoulders, buying their cigarettes at the same newsagent kind of thing. So it's a very kind of fertile area to set any sort of novel, but I think a particular crime novel.
You really get that impression that people are really together. So we've got the canal, we've got Daniel's boat, which, as you've described, having seen some yourself, is pretty awful. It's in pretty bad nick. But then right beside him is his neighbour Miriam, and she's got a beautiful houseboat. And it's a bit like, you know, when I was a kid, I used to imagine that maybe I could buy a double-decker bus and dress it all up and put curtains in it and do a proper house. And that's what it reminded me of when I read about Miriam. She's made this lovely world in a not so lovely life, but it's very small and it's on the water. And she's not part of society, but she has made an existence where she has beauty around her. Was that what you were trying to convey with Miriam, this outsider who doesn't quite fit, but tries to find a place for herself nevertheless? Yeah,
I think all of my characters are outsiders. None of them really. I mean, the characters I focus on a lot of the time tend to be people who don't quite fit. For one reason or another, life has not turned out how they thought it would. They've tried something and failed, or they haven't tried at all. They've rejected societal expectations, what have you. Miriam is somebody who suffered something horrible when she was a teenager, and she's living her life, but she's quite a vengeful person. She's quite bitter about what has happened to her. She's now in middle age. She's not a beauty. She doesn't have any money. She doesn't have a husband. She has no social capital at all. She's dismissed. She's ignored. She's belittled. And she's really not very happy about it. She's understandably furious at the world. And she has chosen a target for her anger. And when you read the book, you can decide whether she's chosen the right target or not. But that's how she is. In all this, she also lives in a beautiful little house that she's very proud of, her houseboat, and she keeps an eye on everything. And she's one of those people who'll make sure that people, pick up after themselves and don't break the rules and that kind of thing. So she's kind of got a busybody-ish side to her too.
She's a great character, and I wasn't sure what I felt about her, whether I liked her, I felt sympathy for her, was she suspicious? She's a very interesting, nuanced character. Even more so, though, than Miriam is Laura. For me, she's the most interesting character in this very interesting book. Can you tell me a little bit about Laura?
Yes, Laura is really where the novel started for me, the character of Laura. I usually start with a character, and in this novel, it was Laura. So Laura is in her 20s. She was knocked off her bike when she was a kid, and as a result has some problems. She's some challenges. She's got a condition called disinhibition, which means basically she has no filter, and she says inappropriate things, and she behaves inappropriately sometimes, and she can be a bit impetuous, and she loses her temper, and all this creates for her a difficult situation in that it's hard for her to hold down a job, to form relationships, to keep herself on an even keel. She keeps making bad decisions or saying the wrong thing, or she says she's constantly kind of firefighting. But I loved the character of Laura, but she's my perfect kind of character. She's deeply flawed, she's messed up, she has all these challenges, but she's also got a really strong spirit. She's generous. There's so much that's good about her, and she's just trying to sort of make her way in the world against considerable odds. She finds herself judged often very harshly by people who meet her, who don't understand why she behaves the way she does. And she there's a frustration in Laura because she just wants to communicate that it's not her fault that she sometimes does and says things. It's not necessarily within her control. She's the kind of character, I think, that is perfect at the heart of a crime novel, because you want somebody who finds conflict wherever they go, whether it be by their own fault or not, who is constantly in some sort of drama. So she is. When I started thinking about her, I did think this was the sort of character that I could craft a novel around, in the way I did around Rachel, who is in some ways similar. Flawed, vulnerable. You may not like her all the time, but there is something good at her heart.
Do you remember how exactly she came to you? Did she come, this is Laura, did she come to you from a book? Did she come from someone you knew? How did this come to you?
Like many things that I write about, I think it's a story that I've heard from a friend who told me about something that happened to their friend. You know, it was a sort of snippet of a story. And I had thought about this. I know I'd read about the condition of disinhibition before, and I thought it was interesting. And then somebody told me they knew this young woman, and she'd had some behavioural changes from an accident, and she was just telling me that there was a huge matter of concern for her family because this young woman was making herself vulnerable through her behavior, but not that she wanted to, but it was just, you know, that kind of thing. It was difficult for her to exist in the world. And then you start thinking, yeah, what is life like for somebody who struggles in that way, who has those kind of problems, who is judged unfairly and harshly all the time? How do you make your way in the world? So that's how it comes from. And that's, yeah, as I say, that's generally how characters come to me, from a small piece of information that I then build something around.
She's very vivid, and in fact, once the book had finished for me, I caught myself wondering how she might be, how she's going, and perhaps that's the mark of a terrifically realised character. What I want to ask you about in a moment is the title, but before I ask you about the title, we've got some questions coming up on the Q&A prompt. So everybody out there, and I know that there are lots of you, don't be shy, it's only in writing. Pop a question down, and I'll be leaving about 10-15 minutes at the end so I can ask Paula your questions. So as those questions keep coming, the title is very evocative. So it's a slow fire burning. What does that mean?
So slow fire is, it refers to the process by which the acid within paper starts to degrade the paper. It makes it brittle, it makes it kind of flake apart. So if you ever get hold of a really old book, possibly at your parents' house or something, one of those old Penguin paperbacks, and you find that the edges of the pages are starting to sort of break away, that is the work of slow fire. So it's something within the acid within the paper starts to eat it slowly from within. And when I read about this, I was reading an article about, you know, the destruction of books in old libraries, and it just struck me that it's a brilliant metaphor for what was happening to all the characters in my novel, who have at their heart some thing inside them, some pernicious thing like shame or guilt or self-loathing or a lust for revenge or even possibly love, that is slowly eating away at them from the inside, and that has the potential after many years to wreak sort of catastrophic consequences on them. It's a book about books. It just fitted really nicely. So that is the slow fire of the title.
So I'm interested in when titles come. So you're saying that it was really important for you to remember what you were writing about, and really this is what unites the characters. Does that mean it was a working title or a working thought?
No, I actually had a different title. I had a number of working titles, none of which I was ever 100% happy with. I'd sort of like thought, yeah, that'll do, or what have you, but I hadn't found it. And then I was reading this article, and I was like, oh, there you go. I think I was thinking of like fiery titles anyway. There's a line in which one of the characters says something like, you'd see the world burn in order for someone to be happy. And I was thinking about fire and burning and things slowly simmering away. And then when I came across this, I was like, oh yes, thank you.
I've got it. Excellent. Jazz, I think we're going to be turning to questions in just a couple of minutes, so keep them coming. They're coming furiously now, which is terrific. One question that I found interesting, or a theme that you seem to have great interest in, is who has the right to tell whose stories? And I think this comes to the fore both in Into the Water and A Slow Fire Burning. And as a writer, or perhaps for both of us as writers, where do we get the stories from, and who gets to tell them? Was this something that you've been interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. Storytelling and how we tell stories, how we tell stories about ourselves, how we tell stories about others, is something that I am constantly fascinated by. And I did write about it a lot in this book. And I've just talked about the fact that I, you know, borrow things from life and I borrow things from people, and then you make something of those people. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think it's natural. I think it's the way we tell stories. I don't think that anyone who's reading my novels would ever recognize themselves, because they're not recognizable. There isn't somebody who's kind of modeled on anyone. There are plenty of writers who do take people and just sort of transport them whole into their books. Philip Roth was famous for it. Truman Capote was famous for it. I think it makes life quite difficult if you're sort of a friend or family of that sort of writer, but there you go. However, we've now got to a point where things are maybe more complicated. Certainly what Theo does in this book is he takes something which someone's actually written down. So then you're taking something and he thinks he's changed it enough and blah, blah, blah. But there's a great sense of entitlement about what Theo does, about taking the story and going, aha, but I am an artist, I will transform it into something different. Without really maybe thinking about how it would make the person whose story you've taken feel, or how changing it might affect them, or even asking permission politely. We have conversations all the time now, don't we, about who ought to be telling which stories. And I don't have wonderful answers. I don't have clear answers, but I definitely think it is worthwhile interrogating yourself and your motives when you're thinking about a character. And why do you want to tell the story? And how are you going to tell it? Are you going to tell it sensitively? Are you going to think about it for a long time? Are you going to think about what it might mean for someone who is like that to read these words? So I think I don't think people should censor themselves, but I also think we need to be thoughtful.
I think you've hit on a very important point. I mean, do you think that as a writer, it's not necessarily your job to give answers, but to promote questions?
Well, that's always my response, which is an easy one, isn't it? But yes, you want to be asked questions. You want to be made to think, don't you? When you read a novel, you want things to be thought-provoking. You don't necessarily want to be told, this is how it is. I mean, who am I to tell people this is how it is anyway? But I do think it's interesting for us all to have these kind of conversations and think, well, I see it this way, and so sees it a different way, and perhaps that's how we get towards an answer, if such an answer exists.
I could keep talking to you all morning for you, all evening for me, but we have our audience who are just as keen to ask questions as I am. So I'm just going to ask you a question from Michaela Rehberger, who might actually, Michaela Rehberger's mother, whose name is Donna. And the question is this. Hi, Paula. Donna from Sydney here. Thank you for taking the time to do this session. You mentioned that you sold Girl on the Train, the Girl on the Train manuscript half finished. It's my understanding that this is not the norm and that agents or publishers will only look at fully finished manuscripts. Am I incorrect in this belief? Or is it because you already had a relationship with your agent that they looked at it for you? Thanks, Donna.
Yeah, it's really not ideal. And as you said, you wouldn't go to an agent with an unfinished manuscript. I already had a really good relationship with Lizzie, my agent. And she said to me, we shouldn't go to publishers with half finished. I said, can you please do it? Because I need some income. I think I probably would have got a better deal if I had finished the book first and then sold it. But I needed an income, and I was very unsure of, as I've said, I had very low self-confidence at the time. I wanted the validation of somebody saying, yes, I want it. Yes, finish this. But yeah, generally it's not to be recommended. I think if you already have a relationship with your agent and a publisher, they might be prepared to have a look at it, but that's not normally how it works.
And when the manuscript was sent out, a half-finished manuscript, did the answers come back quickly, or did the response? Did you have to? I mean, you said at the time you didn't have much confidence, and I think that the waiting game can be a very difficult game. But in this case, even with the manuscript not finished, there was no waiting. The enthusiasm was so great. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. I did have I knew what, I had sketched out the rest of the story. I just hadn't written it yet. So they knew where I was going to go. I think that was important, that they knew that I had an ending for this novel. But yeah, I think we sent, my agent sent it on Thursday and I had an offer on Monday. So it was quick. It was much quicker than I'd expected. I was expecting not to hear for weeks, and then they came back straight away. It was an enormous relief. I cannot even describe the relief.
And did it make it easier to write the rest of the book?
Oh, absolutely. For me at that time, it was like, oh, well, yes, I'm doing this for some purpose now. Somebody is waiting. They are there. They're eager. They're keen. It was enormously helpful to me at that time. But you don't need that. You shouldn't. I mean, it was just that you don't need that. You can get to the end of it without a deal. I know for a lot of people, it's so reassuring to know that someone is definitely going to publish this. But yeah, generally it's not the way publishers want to acquire something. They want to know that you've got the staying power. They want to know that you can finish it.
And follow-on question from Donna: did you try to be part of the Girl on the Train movie? And is it something you would ever want to be part of? I
didn't try to get involved with the film. Would have been completely the wrong thing for me at the time. I had way too much going on. Generally, I've never written for the screen. I would love to, but I've never done it, and I think it's quite a different skill. I did do like an online screenwriting course in lockdown, but I'm not sure that it improved me very much. So yeah, one day it's definitely something I'd like to do, but probably not to adapt my own work. I think I'd rather either write something original or adapt somebody else's work. I think it's very difficult to adapt your own work.
A lot of people are writing novels now for audio and then moving from audio to publishing or print form. Would that be something of interest to you? Would that be a different skill, do you think, to write almost not quite a radio play, but something that's actually meant for the ear more than the eye?
I didn't even know that was a thing. That is interesting, and I know that there are lots of, yeah, I guess it maybe comes out of podcasts. I know there's fiction podcasts, so I guess it would come out of that. I can imagine how it would work really well with a short story. It would be very interesting to think, how do you write differently if it's just for the ear? I'm not sure. That isn't. I didn't know that people were doing that.
Let's move on to Sarah. Sarah asks, do you use an outline before you start writing your novels?
I mean, all the books have been slightly different. What I do definitely need to know is where I'm ending up. I need to know who done it and why. I will probably have a number of other things, the points that I definitely know that I want to get there, but I don't like to plan in enormous detail. I find that if you go like scene by scene, it makes the actual writing quite mechanical and not terribly interesting. You want to leave yourself space. Well, I want to leave myself space to make new connections and to come up with ideas while I'm in the actual process of writing, which is, I think, often where the best and most interesting ideas come. I do think that makes the writing process much slower. I think if I planned everything at the beginning, I would probably finish my novels more quickly than I do. But I don't think that would be as interesting for me or for the reader.
Sounds like you actually trust the process itself then.
Yeah, I mean, I have done it a number of times now. So I think if you've done it, there's 7 novels I've written now, if you count the Amy Silver ones, you do start to trust yourself and to trust the process. I think perhaps when it's your first novel, that's a bit more difficult to do. So maybe you do want more signposts. But what I would say to new writers is do leave yourself some space. Don't necessarily have every kind of chapter planned out, because I think that is quite restrictive and it might sort of confine you from a creative standpoint.
We have another question by an attender who hasn't given their name. It sounds like you might find it distracting to read other authors while you're writing. Who have you discovered recently that you can recommend for us to investigate?
Actually, I read loads all the time, even when I'm writing. I might not read a lot of crime fiction while I'm writing, but I do read all the time. So I just read a novel called Wahala, which is out in January next year, or out in January next year in the UK. I'm not sure about Australia, which is wonderful. And it's it's kind of it's a real mixture. It's set in London. It's kind of about friendship, about a group of women and their friendships and their relationships, but there's a very dark undercurrent going on. Something very sinister. So I would really highly recommend that, or Carla by Nikki May. What else have I read lately? I loved Megan Abbott's new novel, The Turnout, which is a noirish novel set in a ballet school. Laura Lippman's latest, Dream Girl, I really loved. That's another novel about a writer. It's got a strong misery Stephen King vibe to it. I absolutely love that. Sorry, I'm looking at my phone because I take pictures of the books that I've read so I can remember everything that I've read lately. I'm just trying to think what else I can. Lisa Taddei's new novel, Animal. It won't be for everyone. It's really shocking. It's really visceral. If you read Three Women, you'll kind of know the sort of stuff that she writes. That was nonfiction, but it's very, very interesting. It's not an easy read, but I would recommend it. She's a wonderful, wonderful writer. So yeah, I'll stop there. I could go on all day, but I'll stop there.
Ron Dick wants to know when you do your writing. Early in the morning?
I'm definitely a morning person. By about mid-afternoon, I tend to run out of steam, and then I'll read or do admin or go for a walk or what have you. But yeah, for me, the best writing definitely happens in the morning.
And we've got a question from Lloyd Driscoll. In writing of crime and behaviour, do we need to tell the reader everything? Is it cheating to leave some things unsaid, or space for the reader to draw their own conclusions?
Oh, I definitely leave space for the reader. I don't think. I mean, some people find that frustrating. Some people do want to know every single little thing. I don't like that. In my novels, there are things that are left slightly ambiguous or undecided into the water. We never really found out what happened to one of the characters, because I want to give that sense of like, that's what life is like. Sometimes you just don't know. In this novel, there are characters who you can't really ever know completely for various reasons. I love being left with some space to wonder and to draw my own conclusions and to infer things from. I mean, I think the writer should give hints and maybe direct you in certain ways, but I think it's wonderful to leave a lot of space.
Kath has this question, and she says, my daughter is 16 and she wants to be an author when she leaves school and is writing a novel at the moment which is really dark. How do you take a break from being in the dark world of your novels?
That's a good question, because I mean, it can become rather bleak. And I think what I would do is try and counter that with reading lighter things, watching lighter. I watch a lot of television and movies and things, which is light relief. I also think it's really good for your dialogue skills to watch well-written stuff on telly. I mean, if you have to find a way to distance yourself from your fiction. If it's really depressing you, then I think you have to ask yourself whether you're writing the right story and whether other people will connect with it. You don't want to go to, you do have to sometimes think of the reader, is this going to be unremittingly bleak for them? I think you have to try and find, you need redemption in novels, I think, for at least one or two of the characters. I think the novels that I've abandoned have been the ones where I couldn't find redemption for anyone.
On that topic, just very quickly, when I've been speaking to writers lately, the question is, with the pandemic, do they incorporate the pandemic into future work? Or is this just a time that you draw a fence around and leave it aside? What's your gut?
I, at the moment, can't really think of anything I want to write about the pandemic. I'm sure there will be some really good pandemic novels that will come out of this time. I'm not going to write one. I think what will be inevitable is that some people will have suffered terrible trauma, job losses, personal losses, have gone through very, very difficult times, and that it will be difficult to ignore that. It will be difficult to ignore the impact that it's had on some people and on some societies. I think we may have to reflect that without necessarily addressing COVID head on, address the fact that there has been some fractures in society, that inequalities have been exacerbated, or that certain groups of people, perhaps if you were writing a character, say, of a carer, you might say that, you might suggest that they have been through a particularly hard time or something like that. I think it's going to be difficult to pretend it didn't happen altogether. Personally, I don't want to write a lockdown novel, but I'm sure there'll be some very clever lockdown novels to be written. I just don't know that anyone's got a great appetite for it right now. I do remember somebody talking about the fact that while there's loads of wonderful novels set around the First World War, there aren't any set against the backdrop of the Spanish flu. There might be a reason for that.
A question from Caroline. Has there been any interest in adapting this book to the movies or to a mini-series?
I don't have anything, nothing has been sort of agreed yet, but there are definitely, conversations going on, and I'd love to see it adapted. So I really hope that there will be a screen version of some sort, but nothing is planned just yet.
Well, it's a very visual book, isn't it? I mean, the setting is very visual and varied, but also quite contained.
Yeah, so I think it would be lovely to see it actually in the place in which it was set, on the Regent's Canal. So I'm really hopeful.
A very precise question from G. Taylor. What was the online screenwriting course you did during lockdown?
Oof, I will. Can I look it up? And if I can, I will have to email somebody who can then email I don't remember the name.
We can put it in the newsletter in the bad.
Yeah, I'll find it. I will.
We'll take that one on notice.
Yeah.
Shoba Abraham's question is, what are some of the authors who inspire you? You've talked about.
I talked about a few. I mean, there are a number of names that I always mention, and they are people like Kate Atkinson, Margaret Atwood, Pat Barker is somebody whose books I've really loved. Charlotte Wood, I adore Charlotte Wood's. I've loved her last two novels, and The Weekend was one of my favorites of last year. Cormac McCarthy, Barbara Vine. I've been rereading a lot of Le Carré lately, going back to the early Smiley novels, which are just beautiful and so sad. And yes, they're thrillers, but there's just this wonderful melancholy and sense of place that runs through them that I adore. Shirley Jackson, I like, Highsmith. But yeah, they're not. I don't think there are names that will surprise you particularly.
Jonathan asks, is a psychological thriller your genre now, or do you have anything else in mind?
I think it is my genre for the moment. I can't see myself going to sort of other genre fiction specifically. I can't imagine myself writing sci-fi, for example. I just don't read it, so it would be difficult for me to do. But that's not, never say never. I quite like the idea of going sort of slightly more horror. Or sort of, I don't know, something. I mean, I'm a real wimp about those things, but for some reason at the moment, that's kind of where my mind is going.
We have so many more questions, but we have so little time. So, Paula, I'm going to thank you very much and thank the audience before I hand you back to Catherine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, both of you, for a really good conversation that talked about the book, but about your other books, about writing, about reading. So it's kind of the perfect global thing to share on a Wednesday night. That was really fascinating. Now, for those who don't yet have their copy of A Slow Fire Burning, or any of Paula's other books, or indeed Suzanne's books, you can order them online from Booktopia, and the link to our Booktopia page is on our website. So have a look at that. We'll be meeting again next Wednesday, same time. But we'll be talking this time to Val McDermid about her new book in an entirely new series. So that's rather exciting. And then we've got several more sessions after that. Also, if you're a podcast listener, we mentioned podcasts, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and we have a bad Facebook page, book club, I should say, where everybody who reads crime can talk about what they're reading and what they're enjoying. Now, I'd like to thank you again, Paula and Suzanne. I'm pretty sure that everybody has enjoyed the evening as much as I have, and I might actually try and reread the book, because that's the best thing about crime books. People often say, oh, once you find out who did it, then it doesn't matter. But the really good crime book, you get to the end and you actually go back to the beginning, because you may have read too fast to get to the end, but also the richness of the book, the richness of the writing, certainly in this case, is extremely rewarding. So I'll say goodbye for now. I hope to see many people soon, and thank you again, Paula. All the best.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.